Professor Burkett, welcome to Constitutional Chats. We'd love for you to give us just an overview of religion within the First Amendment, freedom of religion, and hear some of your opening comments, and then we'll go to questions.
Sure. Thank you, Kathy, for that welcome. It's always a pleasure to be here because we get such great questions, especially from the winners and the students. So I always look forward to this. So thank you. And thank you for mentioning the AmericanFounding.org website. I think it's going to be a great resource, including on the Bill of Rights. So when I introduce the topic of the First Amendment, and especially the religion clauses in the First Amendment, there are a couple of things that I notice. And I believe this probably came up in your last podcast on the First Amendment. It's the only amendment that begins with the word Congress, which is important, and maybe we'll want to talk about that a little bit more later in the context of the religion clauses. But the other thing I notice, having read the Declaration of Independence, something I always find odd is if you look at the list of complaints or grievances against the king, what you don't find there are complaints that religious liberty is being violated. So what is it that leads to the need or the belief that we need an amendment in our Constitution for just 14 years after the Declaration of Independence? Why do we now need an amendment protecting the free exercise of religion and prohibiting Congress from establishing an official religion? So what happens in the late 1770s, 1780s? I think one of the main reasons we end up with that amendment is because the United States of America, is federal in nature, and that is questions with regard to religion, what the dominant religion is, what religious liberty looks like, vary greatly from state to state. And this is a little bit of an exaggeration, but for the sake of making a point, I'll throw it out there. The sort of American understanding, or the understanding of religious liberty that becomes sort of the American understanding by the early 1800s, is really initially the Virginian understanding. It really is things that are going on in Virginia that take the importance of the individual right to religious liberty and the prohibition of an official established religion. Things that are going on in Virginia in the 1780s especially contribute to this. And we can talk more about those things in detail if anybody's interested, but there is an attempt after Virginia declares its independence as part of the Declaration of Independence, and they've got a new state constitution. They begin by including some of the similar language that will end up in the Bill of Rights. They include language preventing an established religion and protecting the free exercise of religious liberty. And that's because, in part, in Virginia, the official religion had been the Anglican Church, and it was very, very heavy-handed and strict in cracking down on sort of dissenting religions or people with dissenting religious views. So how do we best protect religious liberty now that we have disestablished the Anglican Church, was one of the concerns of the Virginians. The other thing I'll just mention is that in the 20th century, with the incorporation of the First Amendment through the 14th Amendment, when the Supreme Court starts hearing cases with regard to established religions and religious liberty in the 20th century, they often turn to a phrase that is found only in a letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association. The phrase is separation of church and state, wall of separation between church and state. And the courts in the 20th century started using that idea. The founders meant to erect a very strict high wall of separation between church and state. They start using that line from a letter that Jefferson wrote as sort of the foundational idea for how we think about the extent to which religion and government or politics can intermingle. And there's a little bit of an irony in that that language, again, is not in any of the legislation of the time. It's not in the Bill of Rights. It's not in the First Amendment. It's only in a letter from Thomas Jefferson. And I don't mean any disrespect to Mr. Jefferson here, but the real architect, if you will, or I might say founding father of religious liberty in this country is not Jefferson, but James Madison. And Madison, I think, had a very different understanding of the purpose of separating church and state in some ways than Thomas Jefferson. So maybe we can, if anybody's interested, we can talk about that. And the third thing I do want to throw out here just quickly and then I'd love to get questions or have a conversation with you all, is it's important to note that maybe the other big reason there's a need for an amendment of this kind by, with our Constitution, is that prior to and during the American Revolution, but even leading up to it, there's a big shift in how Americans think about their right to be religious. And there's a shift from the sort of old British way of thinking about your right to religion, freedom of religion. And that is the old traditional way of thought had to do with the word toleration, right? The official Church of England was the official church. And if you were allowed to practice some other form of religion, it was tolerated by law, or maybe tolerated by law, right? They might allow you to dissent. In many cases, they didn't. In the United States, in the colonies that would become the United States of America for the better part of 100 years, they are free to practice religion as they see fit. And again, depends on the state that you lived in, but by and large, people were free to practice any number of dissenting religions, Protestant religions, and so on and so forth. And so that habit became ingrained into what Thomas Jefferson would later call the American mind, to the point that the former idea of religious toleration comes to be thought of as a natural right. It's not just that your religious views and beliefs and opinions should be tolerated. You actually have a right to those things, and it is a natural right that is endowed in all human beings by virtue of the Creator, right? By virtue of them being created, human beings. So in the Declaration of Independence, when it mentions the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it says among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And some of the other natural rights that aren't mentioned there, I think, include freedom of conscience and religious liberty. So there's some important factors that lead to the creation of the language protecting religious liberty and trying to prevent an establishment by Congress. So I hope that's a kind of broad enough overview to get us started here, and I'm happy to have a conversation with you all about anything you'd like to talk about. So
Yeah, that's great. And I had never thought about the fact that the First Amendment is the only amendment that starts with the words Congress. So that's a really interesting point. Well, I'm going to turn it over to Tova. Tova, I'm sure you've got some great questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really fascinating overview. And I mean, I'm a little biased, but I have to say this freedom of religion clause has got to be one of my absolute favorite in the Constitution. It's sort of what drew me to the Constitution, just as someone who's Jewish, and it's not really the standard for Jewish people to be in a country where freedom of religion is respected. And at least in my family, we're used to sort of moving around. And so it's really important to have, protections of freedom of religion written to the Constitution. That's something that's really meaningful to me, and probably did a lot to protect the safety of my family and certainly me today. So I always feel very connected and appreciative towards it. And I wanted to ask, why do you think the founding fathers had such a relatively tolerant view towards religion? That's something that's very impressive to me. You look at things like General Washington's famous vine and fig tree speech to, I forget, a synagogue congregation, where he basically said, this country will protect you, and these written protections for freedom of religion, which, as you noted, were not very common at the time. I think still are not common in many countries today. So what do you think led the founding fathers to be so tolerant of religion, especially coming from a system that wasn't, and among so many other countries that weren't? And then, comparing that to other blind spots that they may have had with regards to gender or race or something, why is religion so tolerant?
yeah, thank you, Tova. That's a wonderful question, very thoughtful. And it's a big question. But before that, can I just, maybe you're aware of this, on your point about being of the Jewish faith in this country, it is in fact, the United States was in fact the first country that fully recognized the right of people of the Jewish faith to practice freely since, I believe, the days of the Old Testament, if I'm not mistaken. And are you familiar with George Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation at Newport, Rhode Island? If you're not familiar with it, I strongly recommend it. It's in this famous letter, Washington writes, as president, once he's elected, he writes to virtually every church that has written him. There are all these churches and pastors and preachers and rabbis and writing to Washington, congratulating him on being elected. He takes the time to write back to every one of them. And to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, he congratulates them on being good citizens. And he also writes, I've got it pulled up here in front of me, all possess alike liberty of conscience and the immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. So part of the reason why America is so tolerant is this acceptance in the minds of Americans that religious liberty is an inherent natural right. It is not a privilege. It is not something that you are given or granted by government or by the society that you live in. So as a matter of natural right, you have the right to believe and practice what you want to believe, so long, of course, as that doesn't, as your practice doesn't lead you to, violate the inherent natural rights of others. But it is a truly, in many ways, tolerant society. And I use the word tolerant not because of religious toleration, but because we believe it's a natural right. Now, if I can just say this, and I'm talking too much here, so please jump in. That the degree of how much leeway is given here varies from state to state. I think if you go to the northern states at the time, there's a belief in religious liberty, but at the same time, a lot of the northern states have established religions. They have official religions. When you go a little bit further south, especially into Virginia, the idea here is freedom of religion requires that you not have any kind of established religion, right? To establish a religion is in itself an infringement on the inherent individual natural right to practice freely as you so choose. So there is a degree of variation. One other thing you might consider is Philadelphia. If you haven't been to Philadelphia, I just finished in one of the classes I'm teaching this semester, we're reading Benjamin Franklin's Autobiography, and he was in Philadelphia, of course, right, for most of his life. And it was amazing. It was remarkable how open and tolerant Philadelphia was of all these diverse religions from the 1730s on, long before we declared our independence. So there is a long tradition of this and of being open and tolerant. But by 1776, with the acceptance of the idea of natural rights, it's pretty much cemented that you cannot be persecuted or discriminated against simply because of your religious beliefs or how you choose to worship. Sorry, Tova, that was a really long answer, but it was a great question.
No, it's not about the length. It's about the quality of the answer. It's a very great answer. And then I guess if I could ask, I don't know if this is like a somewhat touchy question or whatever, but I find it really interesting that, that you said the southern states had more religious freedom, but they also had more, I guess, regressive views towards like race and slavery. So I'm curious, why do you think we see this disconnect in the idea of natural rights? Was religion viewed as like a sort of different thing than race or status?
Yeah, that's another great question. And again, that varies from place to place. One exception to this, I think, is South Carolina, which probably had, from the very beginning, some of the strongest and strictest laws with regard to slavery. In South Carolina, they actually had an established religion. Well, the Protestant religion was the official religion, and to get full members of citizenship in South Carolina for many years, you had to actually take an oath that you were a Protestant. So, but in general, I think, Tova, there are a number of ways to think about this. One is, I've heard this from scholars, and I'm not sure if I entirely buy this, but one argument is that Americans in the South, where there's slavery, by the way, there's slavery in every state, right, in 1776, but predominantly in the South. The one argument is that that the eyes of Americans are opening to the idea that these rights are not just the rights of British subjects, right, or the descendants of Anglo-Saxon men, but that they are rights that belong to, or ought to belong to, all human beings. And their eyes are starting to open to this, and they see how it applies to them, but they don't quite see how it applies to people of other races or sex or women, right? So that's one argument. I think there's some truth to that. The other argument that I've heard that I think probably makes more sense to me is that you're creating a new country and you have a lot to do, right? And so sometimes, I mean, there's a lot going on, and it's a miracle that this country ever got off the ground when you think about all the parts that had to be put together and fall into place. And so what you do is you sort of establish what you can, given, you know, the possibilities and the realities of things, and then you worry about other things later down the road. So one argument is we've got to establish the fundamental idea of individual liberty as a natural right, and that means especially the individual right to religious freedom. And then with regard to the problem of slavery, and there are again there's a lot of evidence from the people we think of as founding fathers that they were very well aware that slavery was a contradiction to our natural rights principles. But you establish the idea of rights first, and then you down the road try to resolve the conflicts, especially in the form of slavery. So there are a couple of approaches that scholars have taken, and there's a lot of disagreement over that question. So I tend to lean toward the second, but you know, that's just me. So
yeah, thank you. That's a very, that's a great answer to like a very complicated question.
Very complicated, but great question.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And then now to just get a bit more like into the more legal interpretation of this freedom of religion clause. I guess I'm thinking like, the phrasing is sort of Congress shall make no law respecting or prohibiting the establishment of religion. But I'm just curious, what sort of separates like an established religion from like, I guess, just like personal convictions or beliefs? I think, especially maybe back then, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like religion was a lot more structured, and there was sort of like specific religious structures they had in mind, where there would be like an established church or synagogue or whatever. Whereas nowadays, it seems like those structures are still in place, but I think a lot more people have like more personal beliefs or convictions, or there's like smaller sects. And I'm just curious, like, what separates like a religion from just like a personal or spiritual belief?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I'll try to think about this way. In the 20th century, as I mentioned earlier, the courts have based most of their interpretations of your question on this one letter from Thomas Jefferson. And they draw the line with the idea of what they call, for a while, we're calling excessive entanglement. There can't be an entanglement between government and politics with private individual religious beliefs or even church organizations, right? So the standard that the courts have adopted throughout most of the 20th century up to today has to do with no excessive entanglement. But if you go back to the time of the founding, a lot of them had a very clear understanding of what constituted an establishment. And it wasn't entanglement. They didn't get messed up. They didn't get caught up in that language, which is messy. You can find many documents at the time, official documents in the state of North Carolina, in their own state constitution of 1776. They define an establishment. An establishment is when government, one, pronounces an official religion and requires some sort of compulsory attendance or tax to support it. And two, when government uses taxpayer dollars to actually build churches or purchase what were known as glebes, that's a great old word, church lands, right? So if there's an official pronouncement, this is the official religion, and you must pay a tax to support the building of churches, or to purchase church lands, or if there's some other kind of compulsory attendance requirement, then you have established a religion. And so, that was very clear. What about people praying? In Congress, most people didn't have a problem with it back then. The only, again, with all due respect to Mr. Jefferson, great founder, did a lot of great things, and I highly respect him. The only one of the few people who really seemed to be concerned about those sorts of things was Thomas Jefferson. And not everybody agreed with Thomas Jefferson's views on these things. As I mentioned before, James Madison had a very different idea. If I can do it this way, again, long-winded answer, I apologize. But Thomas Jefferson wanted this wall of separation. And I think part of the reason he wanted it was to keep religion out of government. Because Thomas Jefferson had studied history, and what he saw was that sometimes when religious powers get a hold of governmental powers, they abuse those powers and persecute others. James Madison, who I think is really the sort of father of religious liberty in Virginia, argued, no, if there's a separation, if there's a kind of wall, it's not to keep religion out of government, it's to protect religion from government, from religious regulation, from restrictions by government. Government shouldn't be telling anybody how to worship or how to believe. So this idea of a wall had a very different purpose for Madison than for James Madison. I know that's kind of splitting hairs here a little bit, but in the 20th century, the courts have adopted Jefferson's view, and there were a lot of other views, including the James Madison view around at the time. But anyway, I don't know if that addresses your question at all, Tova, but.
No, it definitely did. I really appreciate the well thought out answer, and thank you for answering all my complicated big questions. And now I will pass on to Lindsay.
Those were great. Thank you.
First, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your wonderful thoughts and insights on this. The freedom of religion is such an integral part of our American way of life, and it's such a personal thing for so many people. So it's so important to just take the time and learn the history behind it, because I know I've learned a lot today, and so many people just kind of ignore that. So it's really great to touch on it. But I had a more broad philosophical question for you today that I've been curious about. So many of the founders seem to believe that in order to uphold a nation, there must be a moral people devoted to the principles of America. So my question for you is, how much should a constitution provide this moral and religious structure? Where is the proper balance between a lack of moral values and then religious tyranny? And then how did the founders approach this question?
That's a wonderful question. That's a really important question. And you have hit on, through your insights here, you have sort of struck upon what was maybe the most challenging question in Congress as they were debating the Bill of Rights, but especially the First Amendment religion clauses and Establishment Clause. So where, look, virtually everybody we think of as a founding father, all of them, including everybody who was in Congress, the first Congress debating these things, they understood that in a republic, a free republic, a certain degree of moral virtue, right, was required, because without that, freedom becomes chaos, it becomes anarchy, and then you really do need perhaps a monarchy, right? So they understood the need for this. The disagreement among them was, okay, where should the guidance for moral virtue come from? Should it come from this national government, which we have established for sort of limited purposes having to do with the whole union, dealing with foreign policy and trade and some other things? Or should the promotion of moral and civic virtue come from the states? And I think the consensus of a lot of them at the time was this is one of the most important roles for the state. So again, why this is important in the debate over the First Amendment is James Madison had, when he introduced the amendments in Congress, he stood up and he introduced all of these amendments. He had one of the amendments that didn't pass Congress was a proposal that that no state shall prohibit the free exercise of religion. Sorry. So again, the First Amendment starts with the word Congress. Madison had proposed Congress shall not prohibit the free exercise, and no state shall prohibit the free exercise of religion. That was shot down. by Congress, and it was shot down primarily by members of Congress who thought that the states should be free to sort of regulate religion and even promote religion without any kind of restrictions. So again, Madison disagreed with that, but part of the resistance to that particular amendment was a belief on the part of certain, it was mainly anti-federalists at the time in Congress. Their belief was it is the role of the state to help people to teach moral virtue to their citizens, and including religious virtue, right? Religious morality. So they didn't want any restrictions coming from this Constitution limiting their ability to promote religion as they saw fit in their particular state. Is that, I'm not sure if I was very clear on that, but.
Yes, yeah, and that was wonderful. And it's so interesting. I love it that everything just ties back to the states. Do you know of some examples of maybe what states did to promote the overall moral integrity of the people? I'm just curious because
Yes.
I hadn't heard of that concept before.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I'll give two, try to be quick. This is a really good question again. One is, let's take the state of Massachusetts. Their state constitution declared that their citizens had the right to religious liberty. They could believe whatever they wanted and they could practice whatever they wanted, but it also established the Protestant faith as the official religion of Massachusetts. And every citizen, the Massachusetts state constitution gave their legislature the authority to tax people to support the Protestant religion, including the payment of ministers for the purposes of teaching Christian morality. So in Massachusetts, they kind of had an established religion, except they didn't require, they strongly, if you were a citizen of Massachusetts, you were required to attend some kind of religious instruction if you could, right? But you could be required to pay a tax to support the teaching of, to support Protestant ministers for the purposes of teaching religious morality. That's Massachusetts, okay? Now let's go to Virginia for this sort of counter example. In the 1780s, 1785 and 86, Patrick Henry, you've heard of Patrick Henry, right?
Yes.
Give me liberty, give me death, right? So Mr. Fiery Revolutionary. After the United States has declared independence from Great Britain, Patrick Henry of Virginia in the 1780s, I think 1784, introduces a bill, it's called the Assessment Bill, which would have raised a tax to support the teaching of Christian doctrine and to support churches in the state of Virginia, with an emphasis on the Episcopalian religion, I believe, in the state of Virginia. So what is Patrick? This is Patrick Henry. Give me liberty. Why is he in favor of authorizing a tax to support religion? You would think that'd be counterintuitive. This, by the way, is what James Madison opposes initially with his famous document called a Memorial and Remonstrance against religious assessments. This also prompts James Madison to blow the dust off of an old bill that Thomas Jefferson had tried to introduce, the Bill for Religious Freedom in Virginia. But what is Patrick Henry thinking? Patrick Henry believes that religious instruction is vitally important, right, to promote civic virtue and moral virtue among the citizens of the state of Virginia. So he doesn't see anything wrong with this being done on the state level. But he definitely doesn't want it to be regulated from the national level, right? So again, all these things were supposed to be left to the states, and the fact that the proposed amendment that would have prohibited the states from restricting free exercise, the fact that that's not there means that even though the First Amendment was passed, the states were in fact left free to regulate religion, promote religion as they saw fit, and even have established religions, until the Supreme Court decides to, look into this through the 14th Amendment. And that doesn't happen until, again, the 1930s or so.
Wow, that is so interesting. I could not imagine the backlash that would occur today if the government paid ministers or had some kind of religious tax. That would be crazy to think about. But to wrap up this specific question, on a historical level, do you think that a lack of overarching moral structure lends itself to disunity amongst the country's people? Like, prior to America, what occurred with that? If a nation was disorganized as far as, like, I don't know, a state religion, did they fall apart more so, or how did that occur?
Yeah, that's another great question. And there are a number of answers to this. I could sort of try to get into the minds of various founders and framers. Again, I just read Benjamin Franklin, his autobiography, and Benjamin Franklin, among the founders, had probably maybe even more than Thomas Jefferson. He had a kind of very condensed set of religious beliefs. He claimed he was always religious and he always believed in God, but he had 5 or 6 very basic religious principles. And he thought anything else beyond that, if you start adding sort of orthodox beliefs and things, that's when religion started getting complicated and overly complicated. But part of the reason I find Franklin's take on these things so fascinating is what he was trying to do was promote religious belief, because he did believe that some kind of religious belief on the part of citizens was necessary for a good society. But how do you promote that without in sort of the simplest and purest way possible, right? So he had 5 or 6 beliefs. There is a God and he rules with providence, and he wants you to do good things for your fellow man, and there's an afterlife and the soul is immortal. And Franklin said these are the basics everybody ought to believe in, right? Now that's Franklin, and so my point here is that even Ben Franklin, who, as I was saying, probably had the most I don't know how else to put this really sort of condensed religious philosophy, if I can use that term, or theology. Even he thought that the promotion of some kind of morality, religious morality, was necessary for the good of society. George Washington is famous for saying in his both in his first inaugural, I believe, and his farewell address, talking about the importance of religion as a prop for virtue, as a prompt for virtue in this country, and how important that is, right? Again, in a free republic. So I think there was general agreement among almost all of the founders that this was important. And just one more thought on this, if you don't mind, Lindsay, because it's such a great question. What a lot of the founders hoped was that that the religious morality that Americans had would sort of mesh or square, if you will, fit nicely with what Abraham Lincoln would later call the political religion of the country, right? The belief that all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights and these other things. If those two things agreed, and they became sort of the sort of foundational ideas that Americans could agree on, then we could disagree over lots and lots of other things, right? But we would be held together by a core set of principles or beliefs. And the most fundamental one being that God created all human beings equal and endowed them all with certain inherent or inalienable rights. If we can agree on that, that should be enough to keep us together, even in times when we're disagreeing deeply over particular policies and things like that. So again, great question, Lindsay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That helped clear up the psychological tangles in my mind about this. I was thinking about it before, but that helps. Now, if we fast forward to the present, what do you think our founders would think about our modern interpretation of the separation of church and state in America?
Yeah, I think they would all say, I'll go out on a limb, I'll just say something risky. I think they would all, including Thomas Jefferson, say we're overthinking it. What do I mean by that? Like, I don't think that Thomas Jefferson, even, who was probably in favor of the strictest kind of wall among the founders of separation, I don't think that Jefferson would, I think he would say we've probably gone too far. So, for example, think of some of if you're familiar with some of the court cases involving prayer in schools. Okay. Should students be able to pray in school? In some famous cases, the court has said no, because that's an establishment, because if it's a public school, it's funded by taxpayer dollars. We have to keep religion out of government, right? The schools are thought of as an extension of government in some ways. Well, I think even Jefferson would say, but wait a minute, you're putting the cart before the horse. Maybe that's not the right metaphor. What about the individual's right to pray? I mean, it's one thing if the school mandates it, that could be sort of sticky, but if an individual student just on his or her own wants to pray at an assembly or thank God in a valedictorian speech or something like that, right? What about that person's individual right to freedom of religion, right? The free exercise of religion. So I think Jefferson would say in some ways the courts have tended to, they've fixated so much on preventing an establishment that they have undermined or downplayed the importance of the individual right to free exercise. So
it's unique. I like that it's more of a simple answer as opposed to increased litigation. I like that. And then, were there any other nations prior to America's founding that took our same stance on religious freedom, or were we kind of revolutionary in our beliefs with that?
Yeah, you got it. We were revolutionary in that. The French tried to follow suit in their own revolution a few years later, and that quickly degenerated into an absolute lack of toleration for any religion, except for the new official religion. This is a great irony if you study what follows. So, this was meant to be a great inspiration to the rest of the world. And eventually it has been, right? There are many countries that have adopted the idea that free exercise is a natural right. But the French, if you study the French Revolution that follows shortly after the American Revolution, they try to imitate us on these things, but within 3 or 4 years, they have abolished all traditional religions and established a new religion, to the Church of Reason, the goddess Reason, and you must worship Reason. So fail on their part. So, but anyway.
Okay, well, thank you so much.
I say we as though I was there. I wish I was there and I could take some credit for it, but they were the first. They established this. So
yes, and it's
Thanks,
so
Lindsay.
interesting to look at all of this, but I really appreciate your time. Thank you for answering all of my questions. This has been really helpful to my understanding, but I hope everybody else's too.
That's fun for me. So thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay and Tova. Both of you just had such great questions. We really appreciate the thought that you put into your questions. And a lot of them mirrored some of the audience questions. We've already answered, a few of the audience questions, but we've got a lot of audience questions today, Professor Burkett. And I want to start with Kyle Jenks, who is one of our listeners who is actually a Madison interpreter. Kyle does a great job and is in Philadelphia. So if you ever need someone to portray Mr. Madison, you might look Kyle up. But Kyle says, does John Locke mention religious liberty as a natural right? Please speak to the importance of William Penn.
Well, I know Madison better than Penn. Penn, I believe, so I'll just, since I know less about Penn, I can be sort of quick on him, but I do believe that eventually Penn, though he had his own religious views, was, as a founder of Philadelphia in particular, was very tolerant and open. He left the city open and tolerant, and Benjamin Franklin was able to pick up on that and really make Philadelphia the most open and diverse city in the world with regard to religion. So I apologize, I just don't know that much about Penn's views on these things, but I can say the other question had to do with, sorry, Kathy, what was the other part?
John Locke. Did
Locke.
John Locke recognize
Right.
religious liberty as a natural right?
You would think, as the philosopher, the political philosopher, that the founders turned to the most between the 1760s and the 1776, that he would have, but he doesn't. He actually wrote a long letter called the Letter on Toleration. And John Locke, again, the great philosopher of natural rights, when it comes to religious liberty, he stops short of going to the length that the American founders were willing to go. So in his Letter on Toleration, he actually draws pretty strict limits to what people can do and practice in the name of their religion. And he is not, Locke is not friendly to, or very tolerant of certain kinds of religions, interestingly enough. I believe of those of the Islamic faith and Catholics, for example. So Locke still used the language of toleration. It truly is an American innovation, I believe, to convert this to a natural right.
Now,
Good
John
question.
Chambers asked about the role of Rhode Island in religious liberty. John says, I thought religious liberty in America started in Rhode Island. Why focus on Virginia more than Rhode Island? As a Virginian, I love your focus on Virginia, by the way. But and John also says Jefferson took the wall analogy from Roger Williams 150 years earlier, leading my focus again back to Rhode Island. So
Yes. But again, it's a great point. In Rhode Island, that the original purpose of that analogy was to protect religion from government. And I'm not sure that's the way Jefferson meant it. So, but why focus on Virginia? And it's true, Rhode Island played an important part in transforming a Puritan society in New England, by the way, which is, again, I'm not trying to knock it, but it's great. We love our stories about how the Puritans came here for religious freedom. But the Puritans came here for their religious freedom and were themselves very intolerant of anybody who wasn't Puritan. The significance of Rhode Island was it provided a great haven, and it was very open to those who wanted to dissent from Puritanism at the beginning. So it did lay the foundation. It did sort of establish a foothold for an open society with regard to religion. But why focus on Virginia? Only because that's done at the time of the American Revolution. And so you finally have, almost simultaneously with the writing and the approval of the Declaration of Independence, you have in writing the ideas of religious liberty expressed in the state constitutions, and especially in the Virginia Constitution. So yeah, I did not mean to suggest, and I'm grateful for pointing this out, that religious liberty originated with Virginia, but the sort of more traditional, or the view that comes to be accepted most widely in this country, I think is articulated best by James Madison in Virginia.
well, thank you for that. And we always like to take a moment during our question and answer session to recognize some of the students who are on with us today. We've got some students from various classrooms across the country. We want to say hi to, first of all, we've got Cami Wanus is with a homeschool student today. And we have Terry Zalesnak with 3 homeschool students. We've got Katie Dice with 2 homeschool students. We have Andrew Christovich with 35 students from Stanton College Preparatory School. So welcome to Andrew and his 35 students at Stanton College Prep School. And then we have Sandra Rudseal with 18 students at Gideon High School. So welcome, Sandra, and all 18 students at Gideon High School. If we have not mentioned you and you're a teacher at homeschool or in another classroom, please type in the Q&A and we'll give your students in a classroom a shout out as well. We love having our classrooms on with us, and y'all bring so much to the discussion. Now, going back to a few more of our audience questions and comments, Mark Hill said, wow, I didn't know that about Massachusetts. So Professor Burkett, that relates back to something you were saying about Massachusetts earlier. And Mark also says, I learn something new every time I watch Constituting America's webcast. So thank you, Mark, for that. And let's see, Linda Bartlett says, more a statement. Recently, I heard someone say our form of government requires morally acting people to lead. So obviously it's not a new idea, but it is difficult. And Lindsay, you had opened that discussion up, and thank you so much for that. And then Kyle Jinks also asks, is there time to address having chaplains in the Army? Professor Burkett, is there something that you'd like to say about that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that was having chaplains serve in official governmental roles was around from the very beginning. So there's been a chaplain in Congress, or there are a number of chaplains in Congress. So there was an initial debate over this, by the way, over whether or not Congress could have an official chaplain. But the debate was primarily, I believe, over, well, how do you select, like if you pick one chaplain or priest or pastor, aren't you endorsing a particular religion? So the way they've gotten around it is to have multiple chaplains, or they rotate them, or right. So there's no particular religion that's represented. And I think that tradition has stuck The Army provides multiple chaplains. It doesn't just hire chaplains from a particular faith or particular denomination. And I think that way of resolving that tension there, because again, the concern was how to avoid establishing an official religion, and that's stuck, and it's become a tradition, and here we are. We still have it. So that has been around for a long time. It hasn't made it. It's still, some people still make it controversial, but it wasn't as controversial back then as it is today, I don't think. So
thank you for that. And then Ernie Vannersdal asked, since the First Amendment says Congress and not states or local governments, does this apply? Did the 14th Amendment extend this protection to states? Was this the original intent of the First Amendment? And then Ernie added, he thinks that the discussion just answered part of his question, but if there's still time, he was wondering if you could explain how the 14th Amendment is used to bring states under the control of the First Amendment.
yeah, great question. So the first part of his question, Ernie's question, it was, I mean, that was James Madison's intent by introducing an additional amendment. But because that was voted down by Congress, and the language of the First Amendment, the first word is Congress, it really did limit these protections to Congress, right? So when it came to regulating religion, promoting, restricting, establishing on the state level, the states were perfectly unrestricted. The First Amendment, as it stood, did not affect the states in any way. With the 14th Amendment, the language of the 14th Amendment, of course, there's the citizenship part. The second part of the 14th Amendment, I've got it right in front of me. I can just look at it. Always carry a constitution, always, right? 14th Amendment. The second part of section 1, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. That clause in section 1 of the 14th Amendment, what they're referring to there is now all of the restrictions or protections that are included in the Bill of Rights now apply to the states. At least that's the idea. Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, part of one of the motives for this amendment, this is a Civil War or Reconstruction Amendment, right? One of the motives for introducing this was to prevent states from violating the Second Amendment rights of African Americans and former slaves, because certain states were restricting them from owning firearms for the purposes of self-defense. And if you know what's going on after the Civil War, there's a lot of nasty stuff going on. So clearly the motive was to protect the rights of individuals from being violated by state governments. The courts started incorporating some of these amendments through the 14th. That is, incorporating just means saying it applies to the state governments now. But they didn't really get into the First Amendment stuff until the early 20th century. Speech stuff, early 20th century, and then religion in 1936 with the Everson v. Board of Education case. I hope that helps.
Oh yeah, that's very helpful. And we're actually talking about the Second Amendment next week. So that's a great lead into that. And now Robert Zimmerman has a comment, but you might want to comment on it. Keeping government out of religion instead of separating religion from government and our country, it seems, should be the way our Constitution should be interpreted.
Well, James Madison would agree, I think, entirely with you, and a lot of other founders. So I'll give you one example. This was an eye-opening moment for me when I read this. So Thomas Jefferson wrote a draft constitution for Kentucky in the 1780s, and it was brought up as a potential constitution for Kentucky, right, which was on the verge of becoming a state. In Thomas Jefferson's draft constitution, clergymen were prohibited from holding office. Why? Because Thomas Jefferson wants to keep, again, don't overdo it, but he was worried about religion and sort of getting too involved in government. He sends that to to James Madison to review. And James Madison writes back, why would you do that? Why would you prohibit clergy from holding office? You are violating an individual, you are punishing a person by violating a natural right because of their religious views. So again, I just use this as an example to show there is a disagreement among the founders, including Madison and Jefferson. For Jefferson, the concern is when priests and clergy get governmental power, they oppress. Madison's view is we want to keep religion sort of free from being corrupted by corrupt. If we have corrupt government, we don't want government to corrupt our religion. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. That's very interesting. And now we only have a few minutes left. So I thought, Aubrey, could we ask that you bring up AmericanFounding.org, which is the Ashbrook Center's new website. And it's really just an amazing website. I mean, you could spend hours exploring this website. There's so much of it that's interactive. And Aubrey is showing us AmericanFounding.org. You can scroll down and you have got different sections of it. You've got the case for ratification, you've got the Constitutional Convention, and you also have the Bill of Rights. And within the Bill of Rights, if you click on it, Professor Burkett, is there any favorite part of your website that you want to, about the Bill of Rights, that you want to direct listeners to? I see you've got Madison's proposals here.
Yeah, that's what I was looking at. Oh, can I say, I'm so grateful that you brought this up, but can I just say that the bulk of the work on this website was done by my friend and colleague, Gordon Lloyd, who you all know. He's been on your podcast
Yes.
as well, I believe. He's been doing this for 20 years. He's been working on this. And I have been blessed to be able to work with him a little bit on adding some things, and in particular on the new section on the Declaration of Independence. But he has included so many great resources here on the Ashbrook website. And my favorite, I think, really is Madison's proposals, because you see what Madison wanted inserted or added as rights, the way that this is laid out here, and then you can contrast that to the final amendments that are passed. And one other thing that comes out of this, the way James Madison introduces these amendments, he wanted these amendments to be what he called engrafted, that is woven into the Constitution. So this amendment should go in Article 1, Section 8. This amendment should go in Article 1, Section 9.
Interesting.
And he wanted it woven in. And so I got to throw a hat tip out there to Roger Sherman of Connecticut, who is also at the Constitutional Convention, happens to be in Congress, and he says, no, let's not ruin the beauty and symmetry of the original document. Let's add them on at the end, so that Americans can see the original work of their delegates, right? Of their, this is the work of the American people through ratification. And then we can see how we have amended it to remind us that this is a work in progress that can be perfected. So that's why I like Madison's proposals and the way they're laid out here. So.
And that is really interesting that they discussed actually inserting them into the actual Constitution and not having them at the end. Very, very interesting.
And by the way, can I just say, Kathy, that's why I think one reason why the word Congress is there at the beginning, because it says Congress shall not, and that was supposed to go in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, which says what lists things that Congress can't do.
Interesting. Okay.
So when yep.
I did not know that. We learn so much every week, but we always learn an especially large amount when you're on. So thank you so much. We really enjoyed having you on today. And we just thank you for your time, and thank you for all of your expertise and wisdom that you lent us to helping design this year's 90-day study too. We really appreciate that. So I just want to, Lindsay, is there anything that you'd like to say to close?
Sure. So good to be with you all today. Have a great rest of your day. I hope you learned a lot. I know that I did.
Thank you. And Professor Burkett, any parting words?
Always carry a Constitution. I have 4 or 5 in my jacket pockets at all times. So, but it's been a pleasure again, as always. And thank you, Lindsay and Tova, for great questions, and the audience.
Tova had to jump to class, but so Tova had to leave us. But and Aubrey, thank you for all you do, and for always being so quick to bring up all the websites and making these chats possible. So thank you to the audience, and we hope you'll come back and be with us next week when we talk about the Second Amendment. Thank you.